Hi, I'm Mark, and I like to talk about British politics and Brexit from an outside view. Some will once again say in the comments, why is he still talking about Brexit? Well, the full impact of Brexit has not even happened yet. There are still transition periods, and that's why I'm still doing that as well. But I said I do that from an outside view. I'm not living in the UK anymore, but I know the UK from the inside as well. So don't worry, I know what I'm talking about. The outcome of Brexit is indeed painful for the United Kingdom, and much of it has turned out to be a failure. But no one kinda wants to acknowledge that. They somehow want to muddle through that again. But a few issues have polarized the British population as much as Brexit. There have always been voices critical of the EU in the United Kingdom, especially in England. And Brexit was essentially an exit. The 2 decades before David Cameron's election victory were successful for the country. The economy grew by an average of 2.5%, and this success story should have overshadowed the memory of Black Wednesday 1992, when the pound had to leave the European exchange rate mechanism. Since then, many Britons have seen the EU as an institution that harmed British interests. A lot of things came along then. The overambitious attempt to give the EU a constitution, the financial crisis of 2008, but above all the wave of migration in 2015. The EU was never popular in England, but it was not a hot topic either. It was the ill-fitting ready-made garment that people had come to terms with when the empire's tailored dress uniform had worn out. Brexit was the result of a mixture of jingoistic nostalgia, resentment against the continent, dissatisfaction with the country's economic and social development, a romanticized exaggeration of their own calling, and a demagogically fueled hysteria. The interests of some major industrialists and investors met the disappointments of miners, fishermen, and small craft businesses. Some wanted less regulation, others more state aid. In Brexit, English laissez-faire liberalism allied itself with a no less pronounced tradition of socialist interventionism. Brexit was accompanied by exuberant promises. The nation's sovereignty was to assert itself against the tyranny of an authority that was perceived as undemocratic. People wanted to return to global free trade. Fishing in British waters was to remain the preserve of British fishermen. The aim was to stem the flow of migrants and regain control of their own borders. A particular role was played by the demand that the £350 million that were allegedly flowing to Brussels every week should be used to rehabilitate the National Health Service. Both was a lie, as we know. Northern Ireland, at least, has lost sovereignty. It remains in the internal market and therefore has to accept standards and controls that neither the regional nor the national government can influence. And Great Britain is slowly realizing that economic dependence is just as binding as contractual dependence. Rishi Sunak once has calmed the waves that his predecessor had whipped up, but at the price of postponing new laws and checks. The so-called sunset clause, with which Johnson wanted to repeal all EU regulation in one fell swoop, was stopped in 2023, as there were ominous Henry VIII powers which amounted to an enabling act. In order to save democracy, democracy should be suspended. It's difficult to assess the effects of Brexit in the areas of economy and health because the effects of the corona pandemic have overshadowed and distorted the consequences of Brexit. British foreign trade is stagnating. There is no sign of a phoenix-like upturn anywhere, and there is little evidence of global Britain. Foreign trade with non-EU countries has risen sharply, but it only accounts for just under half of the total volume. Dependence on the EU for import has hardly decreased from 53% to 48%, but exports to the EU have fallen significantly from 48% to 38%. The United Kingdom has concluded free trade agreements with Japan and Australia, which essentially continue what the EU did before, except with Australia that's getting worse. But more serious is the fact that the much vaunted free trade agreements with the USA and Canada have been on hold for 8 years. And there are no free trade agreements with China, India, the countries of South America and Africa, or with Arab countries. With the EU, Great Britain accumulates a deficit of £12 billion annually. The fact that the overall balance of payments is less disastrous with minus £6 billion is due to the surpluses with non-EU countries and the continued strong growth in services. But they are still transitional periods. And British banks can no longer operate without restrictions in the EU. Since 2016, the EU's share of value added of the financial centre London has fallen from 40 to 31%. And an estimated £1,000 billion have flowed into the EU from London since 2018, while investments from the EU have fallen from over 50 to 31%. And Paris and Dublin in particular have benefited. The mayor of London, admittedly not an objective analyst, put the losses from Brexit for his city at £30 billion. If the foreign trade balance is disappointing, it will be even more painful for British fishermen. Fish do not respect national borders. That is why the North Sea fishing quotas must continue to be negotiated with the EU. The last round of negotiations in December 23 was remarkably quiet, and this suggests that the British side has largely complied with EU proposals. Even more serious is that Norway and Iceland are by no means welcoming British fishermen with open arms. Anyone who has switched to raising fish and mussels in coastal waters will have to provide a mountain of documents with every delivery after Brexit and still risk their goods getting stuck in the traffic jam of Dover and then spoiling. The situation is most bleak when it comes to migration. Cameron had announced that he would reduce annual net migration, that's immigration minus emigration, to under 100,000. In 2016, it was 330,000. Of these, around 180,000 migrants came from the EU and 150 from the rest of the world. In 23, over 700,000 foreigners flowed into the country, and the balance will only be improved by the fact that 70,000 EU citizens and 20,000 Britons left the country. Net immigration was twice as high as before Brexit. And instead of Romanians and Poles, people are coming from Nigeria and the Indian subcontinent. And ghettos are forming in which parallel societies are emerging. Great Britain is threatened with an integration problem similar to that of France. And the situation is no less bleak for the National Health Service, the NHS. Here, however, the corona pandemic has left more devastation than Brexit. At the height of the pandemic, the NHS needed an additional £400 million per week. The alleged and not true 350 million would have even not been enough to maintain normal operations. And the financial misery of the NHS is leading to excessive bureaucracy because scarce resources have to be allocated administratively. Some hospitals have waiting times of 98 weeks for major operations. The abrupt change in the composition of the NHS staff can clearly be attributed to Brexit. The number of doctors from overseas has increased from 72,000 to 115,000 out of a total of 150,000. For nursing staff, the increase was from 67 to 124,000 out of a total of 350k. And since 2018, an exodus of qualified workers from EU countries has continued, and the NHS is most affected. The hope that funds that flow to Brussels up to 2020 could restore the state's finances has been dashed. That's because the country has to raise a lot of money for national authorities and programs that were previously the responsibilities of the EU. A forward-looking agricultural policy is still hotly contested, and for the time being, the government is paying from national funds what the EU used to transfer. And border controls lead to constant traffic jams in front of the Dover ferry port. A 30-kilometer stretch of the motorway leading to Dover has once been designated as a parking space for trucks. If this material financial balance is already sobering, the intangible balance is no less devastating. The United Kingdom has lost prestige and respect. The cohesion of the country's regions is becoming fragile as well. In Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin, that's the Republican pro-Irish party, became the strongest force for the first times on the elections on May 5th in 22. And Northern Ireland benefits because trade with the South continues to take place within the EU internal market, and this weakens resistance to rapprochement with the South. Demographic change is ensuring that the Catholic population will be the majority in Northern Ireland by far by 2050, and this brings a unification of the North with the South closer. And in Scotland, the movement for independence has reached its peak, but the idea is not dead. In addition, new centrifugal tendencies have emerged. Orkney and Shetland are demanding autonomy. If Shetland were to claim its own territorial waters, this would make the situation for English fishermen even more difficult. Brexit was neither a promise nor a curse. The economic collapse did not occur, but neither did all the high-flying prophecies of the Leave supporters come true. None of the country's structural problems have diminished. Rishi Sunak has tried to use smooth diplomacy to avoid widening the gap with the EU. But with Keir Starmer as his successor, this pragmatic policy of tacit harmonization with EU standards is likely to continue now. The common rule book that Theresa May was striving for could become reality through the back door now. The United Kingdom will continue to muddle through with half measures as it did with the introduction of metric weights and measures. The economic, financial and political dominance of Greater London will continue to grow. And despite this sobering outcome, Brexit will not be reversible. The United Kingdom will not receive the special conditions it fought so hard to obtain. The EU will continue to centralize. It wants to expand again by 2030. It's doubtful whether an EU with 34 members, including war-ravaged Ukraine, will still be attractive to the United Kingdom by then. Brexit appears to be a historic turning point, made for many wrong reasons, but one that can hardly be reversed. It should serve as a warning against placing irrevocable decisions of such magnitude in the hands of voters without thinking and without careful preparation. Because that was a non-binding referendum, but the party in charge bound their own hands because they promised whatever the outcome will be, despite its non-binding, they will make it binding in Parliament by following that decision. That was one big mistake I've never seen in my lifetime before. But that is the reality, and everybody that thinks there will be an easy return to the EU or very close ties in a very short time, I'm sorry, but I have to crush those things, because that would be just another set of unicorns just from the other side now. There is no easy return here. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.